kid, but certainly feeling very, very motivated, not realizing at the time, obviously, that it wasn't just the normal way to try to get your homework done and get your college assignments in on time, but this real sense that there must be a way of kind of getting on top of my time and structuring my time that would enable me to sort of, deal with everything that was thrown at me, not have to make difficult decisions and fail to placate certain people who are making demands, and not have to make any choices about which direction I was going in, because I would be so efficient that I would do it all. And you get, well, in my experience anyway, I don't know about yours, you get to this place where you often feel very nearly like you're there, right? You feel like it might only be a month or two of really disciplined work before you're going to be at the sunlit uplands of effortless productivity, but instead you end up sort of making fresh starts every, introducing a new system, downloading a new app, buying a new notebook every month or two. So yeah, that was definitely me. And then I got into a position professionally where I could write about a lot of this stuff and continue to sort of go deep into it. And I think this book is probably what came from sort of exhausting that, right? Realizing that I'd tried like 100 different productivity systems and they hadn't given me the emotional thing I was seeking. So maybe there was a problem with the question I was asking, rather than that I just hadn't found the right solution.
Yeah, there's a line in there you throw away, and I don't remember who it's attributed to, but it's effectively, we teach what we most need to learn, something to that effect.
Right. Yes. Richard Bach, I think, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Yeah. And not only that, in terms of where the book came from, but even in terms of the book itself, right? It's like, it's a whole bunch of advice that I needed to hear and still need to hear. So it's always a little bit funny to me, or awkward, when I run into people who assume that the book describes the sort of daily state of serenity in which I actually live my life, because I don't, and I certainly, I totally still struggle with all of this stuff. But that's what makes it interesting, I think, to me. It's not interesting to write about, to try to grapple with things that come easily to you. So this question of like how you orient yourself inside time in a finite life, I it's endlessly fascinating to me, but I certainly don't feel like I've resolved it all.
You said something a second ago that I think is very important, especially for someone who hasn't read the book. I think for those of us who have read it, it makes a lot of sense. And it's, and I'm going to paraphrase you, but you basically said all of this productivity, all of these hacks didn't give you what you were looking for emotionally. And again, to someone who didn't read the book, that's a bit counterintuitive, because the whole purpose of productivity is not some emotional thing. It's to get more stuff done, right? It's to be more efficient. But I think you're tying it back to something that is much deeper at our root as individuals, that really comes down to time and our view of time, and whether we consciously think about finitude or not, subconsciously we are all aware of it at all times. So let's talk a little bit about that, and maybe, we can do it in any way that you find it helpful, but I think that the way you write about it through the lens of evolution is quite helpful, and how we go from, an era when we didn't keep time through the Industrial Revolution, when all of a sudden timekeeping became essential.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that historical lens is really illuminating. On some level, it's my working hypothesis, my working thesis, that everyone has always struggled with being finite. We are these sort of unique creatures as humans who are both fully material animals and at the same time can think about and know about the fact that we're going to die one day. So we're in this kind of unique, anguished situation. But we haven't always had the kind of ideas about time that enable us to then try to use time management or productivity or planning or scheduling to try to, engage in emotional avoidance of that scary issue of our finitude, right? So all the way back through the record of philosophy, back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, there are people grappling with the fact that there is death. But it's only in a widespread way, with maybe not the Industrial Revolution, but running up to that and certainly beyond after it, that most people were thinking, I think, about time as a resource, right? So it's not just the medium in which your life unfolds. It's like this, it's almost like there's you and there's time, and it's your job somehow to try to handle time in the right way. You feel like you have an adversarial relationship with time, right? Most people feel either hounded by all the stuff they've got to do in the time available, or some people might feel that there's not enough to fill their time with. But all of these things kind of imply a relationship between you and your time, which is actually quite an odd notion once you really start to think about it, the idea that it should be something separate. So I guess at the root of my argument is, the idea that most of the stress and the trouble and the anxiety and the lack of meaning and the things that we encounter in our relationship with time come from sort of pathological versions of this idea that it's something for us to try to use as well as we can, or handle or manage or master. And most of our deepest experiences as humans of truly meaningful and fulfilling moments seem to involve a kind of falling away of those concepts and a falling back into just presence in this one moment that we have. Of course, you need to think about time as a resource in order to do all sorts of things that we do in modern society. But I think a lot of the problems arise from thinking that is all time is, and that there is some place in the future we can get to where we have finally nailed our relationship with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, I think the idea that productivity is a trap is very interesting. The idea that it's a distraction from something else is even more interesting. And the idea that it can never be fully attained is, anybody who's tried, is sadly true. We're not born this way. I mean, those of us that have kids clearly observe young children playing in a way that is untethered from time as a separate entity. Mm-hmm. And yet somewhere along the way, we become inculcated with, and maybe it's to varying degrees, you and I probably more than others, with this sense of time mastery being important. How and when do you think that transition occurs?
I mean, my assumption is that it occurs in all different ways at different stages, and my son is 6, but I absolutely have seen some glimmers of, his father's unhelpful attitudes to time. So maybe it's passed on in the genes, or in sort of subtle ways that I can't clearly control. So he sometimes gets into this place of wanting to be sort of wanting to know exactly what's happening over the next 24, 48, 72 hours. I think here it's most useful, though, just to look at a perspective that much kind of psychotherapy and depth psychology would point to, which is that, in various different ways, as we grow up and as we are raised, even when we're raised by basically excellent parents, there are things that are missing from our sense of things that give us less than a sort of completely comfortable, secure sense of self-worth, and of everything being absolutely fine in the world. There are people who have this much more extremely than others, but there's something that you're trying to fill, right? By the time you're a young adult, there's something that isn't quite ideal there. And I think that we use all sorts of things, and obviously some people use substance abuse and all sorts of other things to try to grapple with these things that feel like they're missing. And I think that productivity is especially people who for one reason or another have ended up with the idea that their value as people, that their right to exist on the planet, or to feel that they are, enough as human beings, is somehow dependent on their output, and on attaining certain levels of accomplishment. The people David Brooks calls insecure overachievers, right? Which is I think a great phrase and sums it up well. I think they're the ones who are naturally drawn to this idea that they've really got to try to double down on the technologies of time control to try to get as efficient as they can and process as much as they can. There are, of course, other people, we know them, right, who for some reason are deeply psychologically invested in not accomplishing things, in making themselves feel that they're not part of that whole, process of accomplishment, of becoming sort of a slacker in a very sort of proactive and deliberate way. So I think in all sorts of different ways, we're just trying to plug in a lacks. And the problems with that are going to manifest in different ways. The obvious problem with productivity as a way to get to that kind of state of peace of mind is just that there's a complete baked-in mismatch between being a finite human being and existing in a world of effectively infinite possibilities, right? Infinite emails you could answer, infinite ambitions you could have, infinite places you could go. If your self-worth is staked on trying to get your arms around all of that, but it's actually an infinite quantity, then that's just going to be an unending struggle.
So what would you say to somebody who says, no, it's different. I can actually do this. Like, I can juggle these 5 projects and I can get my inbox to 0. I just need a little more time. Like, I'm right on the cusp of doing it. And if I just put my head down for the next 6 months, like it's going to be okay. How would you explain to them that that's kind of a fallacy?
I mean, there are 2 ways into that, aren't there? I feel like one is to say that one of the greatest questions in terms of self-change and self-knowledge, which is just how's that working out for you so far, and I think to some extent these are kind of revelations of the middle of life, because you have to have tried this out for quite a while. And, if you're 20, telling yourself that the real part of life is still coming makes a certain amount of sense. When you're in your 40s and you're still telling yourself that the real part of life is coming later and this is still a dress rehearsal for that moment, it might begin to strike you as no longer quite so credible. The other way of getting into that is just to say that there seems to be this pretty much universal law that if all you do is become more efficient, in any system is made more efficient with nothing else being done in terms of you select your priorities. If all you're doing is trying to process more stuff, then all else being equal, that will attract more and more stuff to do into your life. So getting better at processing email at a faster tempo just basically attracts more email into your life for fairly straightforward reasons. You reply to more people and they reply to your replies, and you have to reply to those replies, and you get a reputation in your organization or wherever it is for being very responsive on email. So more people email you. So there's this kind of unending aspect to it that occurs in lots of other domains besides email. And so you can't ever you're not going to get through an effectively infinite supply of something by processing it more efficiently. In fact, the opposite is going to happen. And so I think that's why it always feels like this moment of mastery is just over the horizon, but it's never quite where you are.
It is a very deceitful feeling. for anyone who's struggled with it. I think just maybe the word struggled is the right word, right? It's because you really do feel at times you're so close to just nailing it, and then it will be different.
Yeah.
Tell me about your journeys here. I mean, there's a whole, I'm kind of one of these guys who tries to inbox to zero, never successfully. What is it called the Pomodoro technique? You briefly touched on your dabbling in that. What's that technique, and what are some of the other techniques that people are exploring as ways to defy the gravitational inevitability of what we're talking about?
Well, this is a really interesting point, actually. I think it's one worth emphasizing. The Pomodoro technique, as many people will know, I'm sure, is this approach where you divide up your work time into 25-minute periods interspersed with 5-minute breaks. And then after you've done 4 of those, you take a longer break. And it's just a way of sort of boxing up your time. Other approaches to the sort of classic approach of time boxing that involves, giving every segment of your calendar a specific job. And there are, 100 other of these kinds of techniques. And many, many of them, including the Pomodoro technique, are totally great. Like, there's absolutely nothing intrinsically wrong, I don't think, with them, using this or that protocol for.
When you say great,
through.
Meaning they will increase an individual's productivity?
I mean, yeah, right. I mean, they are fine as a way of structuring your day that might well help you make the right choices, understand how much time you have available, and therefore decide that certain things are more important uses of that time than not. And if you read the writing of the guy who invented the Pomodoro technique, he's very on board with this idea that it's about turning time from being an adversary to an ally by just sort of seeing that in some sense, your time already is made up of 25-minute periods, right? And you could look at it that way. So it's just a question of being explicit about that and making choices about what you're going to put in those times and taking appropriate rests. All of these techniques are, when I say great, I mean all of these techniques are like fine if they work as a way of lending order to the day. I think the real problem that you see again and again, and I certainly had for a long time, is that people see them as, they throw themselves on them as kind of, paths to this salvation that I think we are talking about in some implicit way, because it is a very sort of religious feeling in some ways. They think that they can ride this approach to life to that point of finally feeling like they're doing enough, finally feeling like they're like the air traffic controller of their lives, and that's the problem, right? So I mentioned in the book my early experiments with David Allen's Getting Things Done, the big sort of which kickstarted the modern phase of productivity writing, and there's so much great stuff in that book, some of which I still in some ways practice today. But I was so fixated in this idea that I was somehow going to be able to do everything that I completely missed what he says very clearly early in that book, which is that it's about having too much to do and staying calm in the middle of having too much to do. And I totally took it as a way that was going to help me not have too much to do, because I would have been managing to do everything. And we're just a certain kind of person anyway, I think, really drawn to we just take anything and co-opt it into this psychological project of trying to feel like we're fully in control of our lives in a way that we can't be. I'm fascinated to talk to you about this because it seems that I think you could easily see that a lot of the more physical, biological stuff could easily be dragooned into a similar kind of project of feeling in total control of our situation. I don't know if you see that happening.
I do.
In yourself, maybe. I don't know.
No, absolutely. And I sort of write about this in the epilogue of my book, where I sort of say, I think when my obsession with this topic began about a decade ago, I mean, maybe 15 years ago in one way, but really in earnest a decade ago, there's zero question in my mind with the, with the benefit of the retrospectoscope I have today, that it was 100% a how do I run from death? Basically, it was just, this is just I'm going to put my head in the sand and march my way towards something that deep down I know is impossible, which is immortality, but I'm going to focus so much on this thing that, I'm not going to confront my fear of death, or I'm going to confront my fear of death by shouting louder at that fear with this thing. This thing. And this thing is all the things I'm going to do to live longer. I think a lot of people can relate to that, and I think people have different reasons for it. I talk about what my reasons were for that, but I can say now that I realize that completely. I have a slightly different take today, but like you, I still struggle. Meaning, I still watch people die and get very sad. Just recently, someone who I actually had on the podcast died. And he was, in his early 80s. So, by most people's standards, hey, he lived to and maybe slightly beyond normal life expectancy. But I don't know. It always bothers me when someone dies, it still does. And I intellectually, I know that that's a very bizarre way to feel, that, he had his 4,000 weeks. He did a lot with those 4,000 weeks. He had a wonderful family. Like, you have all of these things, like, there's nothing to mourn other than the fact that he's not here. And yet I still have a sense of sadness about that. And I understand that part of that produces a distraction from what's happening today. Like, if you dwell on that too much, you miss out on the fact that, well, the best thing you can do to honor the legacy or the memory or whatever is to do your thing today. But you write, another thing you write about that I love is the challenge of trying too hard to be present. Right. This has also this has equally become kind of cult-like, which is, I am going to be the most present person